If we could reassemble. I know you have a lot of friends you want to talk to, but we want to get this panel going because we have quite a bit to still cover. I want to introduce our next moderator, my very dear friend Mary Jo Meisner, Vice President of the Boston Foundation, and she'll be moderating a panel, and I've asked all of our panels to keep their interventions quite short so we can move on with the program. And again, as I said, we will be holding breakout sessions immediately after we conclude this afternoon to continue this discussion with your questions and hopefully some answers. Mary Jo Meisner.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mary Jo Meisner. I'm Vice President for Communications and Public Affairs at the Boston Foundation. I'm hoping that many of you are going to return to the hall for this presentation because I think it's going to be a very good one. It is my pleasure to join you all here today for this important teach-in. And in keeping with kind of the teach-in format, we're going to work right through lunch, as is obvious. We're asking you to sacrifice a little bit and fast until the end of the day, and then you can take this all in and have something to eat and discuss amongst yourself. But for now, we're glad that you're here and sticking with us through this. So we have just heard about who the system is failing and who it's working for, the winners and the losers. And now we have a panel of individuals who have been asked to discuss what they consider to be some of the political and economic failings that have brought us to this moment where we feel that we need to reclaim our economy. What went wrong is what we want to know from these folks. I'm going to introduce all of these distinguished 6 panelists at once, and then I'm going to call on each one of them in the order that they appear in your program. And as Barry noted, we do need to make up some time here, so we've asked each one of them to see if they could cut back a little bit on their presentation so that we ultimately, at the end of the afternoon, have an opportunity to interact with the audience and engage in some Q&A, because really, in the end, that's what this is about. I think we want to have a discussion and not just a series of presentations. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists. They include Tim Ferguson. Tim is at my immediate left here. He's founder and chair of Next Street Financial, which is a merchant bank whose focus is on providing capital to small and mid-sized firms, especially in urban and low-income areas. Prior to Next Street, Tim was the head of investments at Putnam Investments and CEO of HSBC Asset Management. Next Street has provided over $130 million in capital for 80 employers that now generate over $600 million in annual revenue and jobs for 4,000 people. And I want to note that most of those are located in low-income areas in our city. Next up, we have William Dickens. William is Distinguished Professor of Economics and Social Policy here at Northeastern. His research areas include labor markets, wage determination, and unemployment. He is currently co-director of a major international research project on wage rigidity, a collaborative effort involving the Brookings Institution, the New York Federal Reserve Bank, the European Central Bank, and economists from 13 countries. Next, we have Bob Culver. Bob is a good friend. He's currently an economic development consultant, but most recently Bob was the president and CEO of Mass Development, which is the state agency here in Massachusetts that works to strengthen the Massachusetts economy by helping to create jobs, increase the number of housing units in our state, and address the infrastructure challenges that limit growth. Bob is also a former senior vice president and treasurer here at Northeastern University. He's held senior leadership positions at other major East Coast institutions, including Yale University. Next, we have James Hackney. Professor Hackney teaches also here at Northeastern Law School in the areas of tort, corporate finance, corporations, critical race theory, and law and economics. Professor Hackney's research focuses on intellectual history, torts, the mutual fund industry, and the critical race theory. Following him, we have Senator Dan Wolf, who's in his first term in the Massachusetts Senate. He represents the Cape and the Islands. a Senate chair of the Joint Committee on Labor and Workforce Development, a pretty prestigious committee chairmanship for him to get in his first term. But many of you may know that Dan is the founder. He helped found several years ago, 20 years ago, what has now become Cape Air and Nantucket Airlines. Cape Air began with one airplane and one route, Provincetown to Boston. It is now, 20 years later, one of the largest independent regional airlines in the country, serving more than 36 communities and more than 700,000 passengers annually. And they also employ about 1,000 people and is one of the largest employers in the region. I would be remiss in not noting also that an important part of his resume, he's the father of Zoe Wolf, who we heard from at the beginning. And finally, John Quokka, who is the Neil F. Finnegan Distinguished Professor of Economics at Northeastern University. John has written and consulted extensively on various issues in industrial organization, regulation, and antitrust. His book, The Antitrust Revolution with L.J. White, is a compilation of case studies of major antitrust proceedings, and he has also authored Power Structure, a study of public-private ownership, vertical integration, and competition in the U.S. electrical industry. So with that, I'd first like to ask Tim to speak.
Thanks, Mary Jo, and good afternoon, everybody. I think that the single biggest failure in terms of what went wrong is about leadership. And leadership, not just in our business community. It's really easy to vilify our business leaders, which may or may not be appropriate. I'm not going to make a comment on that. But I would argue that just as much our academic leaders, and in particular our political leadership, has failed us over the past decade. So all segments of society have been missing. What's happening across the world today involves many different players, including, but not limited to, Wall Street, and its origins predate 2008. I think it's easy for us to think of the credit crunch, the credit crisis, as being the origin of the issues, but actually it's way before that. And it's a referendum on business as usual and a call for fairness, as we heard from the earlier panelists. It involves government, it involves the private sector, both large and small businesses, the public sector, and has some elements involved in terms of global institutions as well. It's about institutions that were created after the World War, after the Great Depression, that did a great job for 40 or 50 years, but they've outlived their intended purposes. Institutions that in many instances have continued to exist without adapting to the times. An example of that was what Elise Cherry referred to earlier with the Federal Housing Authority. I mean, can you imagine that they won't allow principal to be an element that's reduced in terms of the mortgages in the foreclosure crisis? It's about entrenched interests at all levels and sectors, special interests, PACs, and so on, that need to be broken. It's about fairness. It's about access to competition. And grassroots movements, for me, bring awareness to the challenges of our time. So actually, the Occupy movement is something that I thought finally the grassroots are actually beginning to do something and beginning to mobilize, which I think is important. And they can catalyze the change that we seek. They have been and will continue to be an essential element of a healthy democracy. I'm not sure I agree that they can be leaderless. I think leadership, even in a more democratic, consensus-based movement, is important. And I'm going to actually use two examples of something that happened that was about the mobilization of the grassroots. One was the whole service nation movement that Alan Casey, who was one of our candidates for the Senate, moved with his Be the Change organization, which resulted in 140 different entities, non-profits mostly, creating a coalition and eventually ended in the Kennedy, I think it's called the Kennedy Service Act, which is a $5 billion appropriation to increase the number of jobs available or stipends available under AmeriCorps from 80,000 to 250,000. That happened in 18 months and was the result of a huge mobilization of resource. However, effective leaders need to be comfortable taking risks in order to get things done and to disrupt change business as usual. Leadership is really difficult for a reason. Vision and will alone are not enough. You can have the best ideas in the world, you can use a platform to talk about it, but it's not enough. What we're missing today is the courage to mobilize that vision and will. It's really, really hard to do. It's often unpopular, and you often have significant entrenched forces that are arrayed against you. There are many moments in US history when our presidents, and I can now say our, because we became citizens as a family in April of this year, and we're very proud of that, have acted with great courage. So just think about it. The Great Depression, FDR, he pushed through the New Deal to create jobs, stimulate economic growth, and create a regulatory infrastructure against a lot of opposition from what today we would call Wall Street. Critics may disapprove of his style and his tactics, but he made difficult decisions and succeeded against great odds. That is why he is regarded consistently as one of our top presidents. Civil rights. Lyndon Johnson took the baton, took the mantle from JFK, and despite the opposition and his southern roots, signed the Civil Rights Act into law in 1964. He risked losing the South, a Democrat stronghold at the time, and his presidency, and in fact, as you all know, didn't run for a second term. Here's how he put it. It's the price of leadership to do the thing you believe has to be done at the time it must be done. There's still work to be done, but the end result at the time was complete legal equality for all citizens. Today, let's think about some of the initiatives that are out there a little bit, like Race to the Top, Startup America, and Open Government, to name a few, have the potential to change business as usual, and of course healthcare reform would be another. So the Race to the Top Fund, it changed a lot in terms of legislation. It forced the states to think about how they could get what was a relatively small amount of money to help to change the system in order so that they could get it. Look at individuals within the educational movement. Someone like Michelle Rhee, very unpopular amongst a lot of people, but an outspoken champion for education reform with an absolute laser-like focus on the recipients, i.e. the children who we're trying to educate, as opposed to the system that a lot of people are trying to protect. In our own state, what Deval Patrick did, Governor Patrick did, by bringing together all of the different agencies that into one, now called Massachusetts Department of Transportation, as we know it, MassDOT, in 2009, he did something that meant he had to be out there and that was extremely unpopular in terms of what it represented. Whether I agree with it or not, what Howard Schultz is doing with the Starbucks initiative with OFN, the Opportunity Finance Network, the $5 that leads to $35 of lending to smaller businesses that will help to create jobs, is actually something that's happening despite the established institutions of the SBA, the Treasury, and others. And I think that perhaps one example that I learned about recently at a movement called Opportunity Nation was the CEO of a company called Southwire, which is a business that is in Carroll County, just south of Atlanta, about 35 miles south of Atlanta. They had a huge issue, the same issue that we heard about earlier on today, in terms of the number of kids that weren't going to graduate high school. They took their own money, their own resources, and they created a separate plant. They're a leader in distribution cables for high voltage electricity, and they created a completely separate plant where the kids go to school for 4 hours a day, and they earn money, they do a job for 4 hours a day and produce a product. And the whole thing about self-esteem, self-worth, the ability to actually realize what something could become was enormous. That takes leadership. Can you imagine if GE did that with multiple of their plants around the country, what difference potentially it could make? So it's people stepping out there and really leading from the front. So, I would argue, just to finish, because I know we're short of time, that the nation and the world need the same kind of leadership that we saw in the 30s and the 60s. And while things are far more complicated today than they were back then, the key attributes of leadership have stood the test of time. Vision, will, capacity, and most important of all, courage, and not abdicating it when the times are tough. That's on that note, I'd like to finish, so thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Now we'd like to hear from William Dickens.
Okay, how do I advance?
There we go. So I want to talk about what went wrong with fiscal policy. In the early days of the crisis, there were two major things that we undertook at this country to head off a worse crisis and then to try to pull ourselves out. And there's a lot of misconceptions about both what was done and what the effects of what were done was. So two myths in particular. One of them is that the stimulus, or that we tried stimulus and that it failed. Nothing could be further from the truth, and I want to talk about that. The second thing said is that when we bailed out the banks, we wasted a lot of money and didn't get very much for it. Again, I think that's absolutely wrong. I think that we did get a lot for it. We prevented a depression-scale collapse of our financial system. Capitalist economies need banks. They need financing for people buying homes, for businesses to expand. Without that, we would have had a much, much, much worse depression than we did. However, that program was not particularly well managed, and as a result, the bankers who took advantage of it, or not all of them, but many of the bankers that took advantage of that program have behaved badly afterwards, and we certainly could have done a much better job managing that program. But don't confuse the arsonists with the apartment that they live in. We all live in that apartment building. They started the fire, we put it out, and they're playing with matches again, some of them, but we may need to put it out again. Let's hope that next time, if we do, that we do a better job with it. But let's talk about the American Reconstruction and Recovery Act, or the stimulus bill. I want to argue it was too little, too late. So, no, the date on that is not wrong. This is a talk I gave here at Northeastern in February 11th of 2009, and I'm going to run through it really quickly, or at least some of the slides, because what I want to show you is that, in fact, it wasn't just me now making excuses, but I predicted that this was going to happen, and I wasn't the only one who predicted that this was going to happen. Virtually any economist worth his salt saw the 2009 stimulus bill, shook his head or her head, and said, this isn't big enough. It's nowhere near big enough. So those were the things I talked about then. But I just want to show you, let's see, I want to go through this quickly because we've been asked to speed up. So this is what the CBO was predicting at the time of the crisis. And you can see that we were supposed to have, oh, no, this isn't centered well. Oh, well, you can't see what the CBO was predicting terribly. Well, no, you can. It's just that 2010 is off the screen there. But as you can see, they were predicting a rather quick recovery from the recession. But what I said was that I didn't see that at all. First of all, I didn't see what was going to cause the turnaround that they said was going to happen. Their model has strong tendencies towards self-correction, but that doesn't seem realistic to me given what I've seen in the recessions that we've had, particularly the 1982 and 1974 recession. And other scholars agree that were it not for the Federal Reserve lowering interest rates and stimulating demand, we would not have gotten out of any of the recessions that we are in. And of course now we're in a situation, since World War II, of course now we're in a situation where the Federal Reserve can't lower interest rates anymore, and so we're left with fiscal policy as the only way to increase aggregate demand and put people back to work. But once again, I was saying that the CBO's predictions were going to be gross underestimates of the magnitude of the crisis, because
there was something new about this crisis, and that was the financial crisis that set it off. We have very little experience with financial crises. Instead, and with the situations where we do see fairly large financial crises, we see great trouble recovering from those sorts of recessions. And finally, this was going to be an international crisis, and exports were going to be hit, and most of the models weren't taking that into account. So I was quite convinced that things were going to be much worse than what was being predicted at the time. But despite that, I took the CBO at its word in terms of what they said was needed, which was about $820 billion worth of stimulus effect in each 2009 and 2010. And then I calculated the likely impact of the stimulus bill as it was written. And the problem was that, yes, there was about $700 billion worth of stimulus, but it was spread out over 10 years. And as you can see, no more than about half of what was needed in either of the first 2 years. And in saying this, I'm just saying the exact same things that others have said about that 2009 stimulus. Even President Obama's in-house advisors were telling him that the stimulus was not going to return us to full employment. Well, this is what I would have done back then. Aim higher. Cost of undershooting is much worse than the cost of overshooting, and we're living with those costs of undershooting right now. More of the stimulus up front. More relief for state budgets. That's an important one because state budgets have been a major reason why the recession has been as bad as it has, is the contraction of those budgets and the laying off of state workers. Further extension and expansion of food stamps and Medicaid to protect the people who are most vulnerable in the economy. More tax cuts and consumption subsidies. The reason why I was for tax cuts and for tax cuts for working people and consumption subsidies is because they're fast acting. More shovel-ready infrastructure. And finally, I was very worried that by not doing enough, we're inviting even more problems with financial markets, and then that could cause the cost of rescuing the economy will continue to climb. I was luckily wrong about that so far, but now we face a major financial crisis in Europe and the possibility that it will rebound to the United States, and we are not in a very good condition to deal with that if that happens, largely because of our very anemic recovery. So, if we want to create jobs, we should create jobs. That means giving money to states to rehire the people that they've laid off and to build new and to go to work on infrastructure. We certainly need to extend federal unemployment benefits again. We should probably keep intact the payroll tax cut. Virtually everything in President Obama's job bill is good, it's just too small. If we're going to get out of this recession, I strongly imagine that we're only going to be able to do it if the government sets down and decides to create the jobs that we need. Thank you.
Thank you, William. And now we'd like to hear from Bob Culver.
I'll try to be as quick as possible with no slides. Before I start, I want to say something to the students and to the faculty and to any other alumni of Northeastern. The last time I stood here, I can't help but remember, was 21 years ago. 21 years ago, last time, and I stood here to announce that Northeastern University had gone through the moral equivalent of the recession we're going through. That the university had expected to have a freshman class of 3,500 pupils, there was only going to be 2,400. And the result would be devastating on the university, and therefore, this room being filled with faculty and administrators, I had the unpleasant task of announcing that 150 people would be laid off on or before January 15th, and 650 positions would be eliminated from the budget over the next 5 years. I am here to tell you that one could not be more proud of an institution that took on its own recession, and in the true, even before it came the word of the day, in the true together we can spirit, Jack Curry as president, Michael Baer as provost, myself as the executive vice president and treasurer, put together a program and together with the faculty, the students, and the administration, transformed the debt, the physical structure, the faculty, the administration, and even the student body, such that this room that we were sitting in then was a dark Victorian-like theater. You couldn't have been in a more depressing environment in which to give out that news. But together, over 20 years, this institution has demonstrated the type of transformation, whether you want to look at program, people, debt service, budgets, you name it, that we would hope would come out of our society over the next 20 years, this Northeastern being a microcosm. And I would note that during that time, Jack Curry was the only, there were 13 presidents from major universities around this country that were fired because they somehow couldn't hold it together as we all went through this mess. Jack made it all the way through, and he set this wonderful institution straight. And I just think it's important for those of you who are with the institution to understand it has been through something on its own that is like what we are talking about today. Now, what do I have to say? My comments are really, just sort of, they're kind of heuristic, big word heuristic, right? The economists all do deference. Barry is sitting in the back, I know, somewhere saying, Bob, what are you going to do? You're going to talk about the new normal. Well, here's the issue. Whether I were Karl Marx or Schumpeter or, one of the sort of right-wing economists, I think most everybody recognizes the following: we hold this to be the truth. It's a little bit of theory, and the truth being that capital seeks to displace labor every place it can if it can reduce the cost of goods sold, increase productivity, and give a higher return to capital. No matter what your politics, no matter how far you go back, since the time that technology came to be understood as technology and a labor displacement vehicle, an efficiency and effectiveness vehicle, that is basically the rule we have. Now, what I'm here to say is that it would appear, and the literature continues to develop that supports this, I'm afraid, that therefore there are no new jobs per dollar of capital being spent. Now, what do you say, Bob? What are you talking about? What does that mean? Well, here's what it looks like. 20, 30 years ago, if you built $1 billion plant in Massachusetts, put $1 billion worth of capital in the ground, you would have been called Wang or Prime or Digital Computer. We would have been running around the state, the governor, yes, and I worked for the governor in his first administration as the assistant director of operations for the MBTA. We were running around with CETA programs. We were trying to get, teachers to leave their jobs and become computer programmers, and articles in the Wall Street Journal. We didn't have enough labor to deal with effectively the capital investment that was being made by this new thing called high technology. $1 billion. There were these plants required about 5,000 to 7,500 people. That's roughly what you can tell, $1 billion worth of capital required. Today, fast forward, and out at Devon's, a place that I used to have some responsibility for at Mass Development, you put Evergreen Solar, and you put Bristol-Myers Squibb's largest pharmaceutical manufacturing plant in the country, Evergreen Solar, 3 football fields long, dealing with solar panel manufacturing. Together, it's about $1.4 billion for the new technologies of our era. And you're lucky if on a good day, and forget about the Chinese stuff and all that other business, on a good day, together they employ about 1,200 to 1,500 people. Keep therefore the ratio in mind, that you've got roughly, 1,000 versus 7,000 for $1 billion worth of capital invested. You move forward to East Cambridge, or to Cambridge proper, across the river next to the business school, to the biotech folks, And you look at $1 billion going into manufacturing, and maybe you get 300, 350 folks. You move forward to the Silicon Valley, to our friends that are doing Google and Facebook and all this other sort of stuff, and I don't even know whether you got $1 billion worth of capital being invested, but you're making $55 billion and maybe employing 20,000 people. So the thing that Karl Marx, okay, worried about, and people got all upset about when he spoke about it, was that there were these contradictions within capital. The thing that Joseph Schumpeter equally worried about and talked about creative destruction. And note, for those of you and my dear friend Congressman Barney Frank, I would note to him when he brings up, this creative destruction, and that's the good news because it's going to be destroyed and built again. I said, Congressman, you've got to remember, how many people know the title of Schumpeter's book? Anybody? It was called Capitalism, Democracy, and Socialism. And Schumpeter's were, and for those of you who don't even know who Schumpeter was this great economist over at Harvard in the last century. Schumpeter basically said, look, this is going to happen. Technology is going to get better and better. It's going to move faster and faster. There's a guy named Moore who developed Moore's Law. For those of you that are in IT areas, you know about this. And it's just the multiplier effect of technology. This phenomenon is no one's fault. We're smart people. We are developing, some of the last things that I financed. I financed I'll be off in just one second. A warehouse, robotizing a warehouse, laying off 17 stock pickers, okay? That was a good thing, right, for the person in the warehouse. The Globe itself, totally automating the printing process. That was a good thing. Why? Because capital seeks to use labor, capital seeks to use technology to what? To reduce the cost of goods sold and increase productivity, and the extent to which that involves displacing labor, it will do that. Now, what does everyone agree on? It means that therefore there has to be a dialogue and there has to start being agreements, and Angela Merkel in Germany seems to be the only person that kind of gets this, okay, that we have to start talking about the relationship between capital and labor and technology. Because otherwise, we are going to have all of this unemployment. Final note, also if we don't deal with that. We are a society that is based upon, the American society is based upon 95% of its employable people being employed. That is 5% unemployment. That 95% are supposed to consume 70% of their after-tax disposable incomes to be spent on consumption. Today, we are down to 80% real employed, and go payroll to payroll, and then of that, savings is going up. Someone said it's not, but savings is going up. I mean, people are scared to death, okay? And consumption is going down. If even the wealthy, the 1%, don't address this phenomena of technology, capital, and labor and their perverse relationship right now, consumption will go down such that it will cause no one to be able to buy the products being produced in this very efficient way. We have no choice, therefore, but to have a dialogue with our friends in labor, with our friends in capital, and our friends, the people who are trying to invent new technology, and figure out what the right balance is to allow us to be able to work and live in ways that are meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Now we'd like to hear from James Hackney.
Thanks. I was actually a very junior faculty member, Bob, when you gave that talk, and it's good to see that you're still bearing good news. You're a really fun guy. So the title of my talk is Ideology, Policy, and Pain. The subtitle is a truncated account of the underpinnings of the financial crisis. Since my time has been cut in half, it's going to be a truncated account. We're going to begin with ideology, and we can look to two very prominent free market economists, F.A. Hayek and Milton Friedman, in terms of the genesis of free market ideology and the road to the deregulation that's the foundation for the 2008 financial crisis. Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, published during the World War II, made the basic argument that any government intervention would lead to socialism and thus lead to tyranny and totalitarianism, a very powerful argument in kind of post-World War II politics. Some 40 years later, Milton Friedman, along with his wife Rose, wrote Free to Choose, which again is a kind of free market manifesto. I remember as a high school student reading it with, just, it was this magic moment. Even though I ended up being a lefty, it still had that type of impression upon me. Because what Friedman did was to match the ideology with concrete policy proposals we see manifest to this very day, in particular the push towards deregulation. Institutionally, this derived principally out of the University of Chicago, its law school, economics department, and business school. This is the intellectual foundation behind the Reagan Revolution, the ideology of free markets and individualism. If you care to read a very good chronicle of this, I would recommend to you Daniel Yergin's The Commanding Heights. Policy. The thing that they railed against, the free market economists, was a piece of legislation referred to as the Glass-Steagall Act of 1932. What Glass-Steagall did was to separate out commercial banking, investment banking, and the insurance industries. And principally, what the authors of Glass-Steagall had in mind was to not allow commercial banks to engage in speculative securities transactions, hence the separation between commercial and investment banking. Fast forward to 1999, the passage of Graham-Leach-Bliley Financial Services Modernization Act and the repeal of Glass-Steagall. And Graham-Leach-Bliley was really just a capstone. Glass-Steagall had been severely undercut through a series of judicial opinions as well as regulatory interpretation by Alan Greenspan, then chair of the Federal Reserve Board. So Graham-Leach-Bliley, one of the cornerstones of deregulation leading to the 2008 crisis. The other cornerstone of deregulation, I actually forgot about my slide, I was so into the talk, is a Commodity Futures Modernization Act passed in 2000. And what the Commodities Futures Modernization Act did was to deregulate a financial instrument referred to as derivatives. And derivatives are essentially financial instruments that allow you to bet on either the appreciation or depreciation of an asset. That was the policy. Now let's look at the pain. The principal manifestation of the pain is the housing bubble and the bursting of the housing bubble. Now, the genesis behind the housing bubble, we can look to first a restructuring of financial institutions that was allowed given Graham-Leach-Bliley. So what we have are not commercial banks and investment banks and insurance companies, but financial conglomerates. And the financial conglomerates have an increasing appetite for risk. One, because it helps the bottom line, at least in the short term, and also because it helps in terms of the wallets and the paychecks for those who run these institutions. An exemplar of this kind of morphing of financial institutions is that Goldman Sachs, which is clearly an investment bank, is now considered to be a quote-unquote bank, or more technically, a bank holding company. The risk is manifest when we connect it to the 2008 crisis. to the instruments we most closely associate with the crisis: CDOs, collateralized debt obligations, and CDSs, the infamous credit default swaps. Now, what are these instruments and how are they connected to the bubble and the crisis? The CDOs were the bundles of assets, and for our purposes, the most relevant type of CDO are the subprime mortgage CDOs. So you bundle these together, the magic of diversification means that the risk is reduced, but it's not totally eliminated. So what you do if you're a smart financial engineer is you hedge against those risks. How do you hedge against those risks? You purchase or acquire a derivative, a CDS. So there's a symbiosis between the CDO market and the CDS market. And what these created, because there are fees that are gotten from CDOs by financial institutions, i.e. Goldman Sachs, there's money to be made on CDSs and writing CDSs. In particular, if you hold a CDS that, quote unquote, shorts the market, makes the bet that the housing market will collapse, there's a lot of money to be had, and a few people actually did make a lot of money shorting the housing market. But what they created was an absolute demand and a vociferous appetite for mortgages, more of these assets to bundle together. How do you get to that? You get to that through the subprime market, through the practices of predatory lending, etc., all of which contributed mightily to the housing bubble and the pain. New policy. Dodd-Frank, Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, signed into law by President Obama in 2010. Now, this is a massive piece of legislation, and anyone tells you they know everything that's in it is not telling you the truth. But I want to focus on a few of the critical features. One is the Financial Stability Oversight Council. And this is a council composed of, it's chaired by the Treasury Secretary. It is also composed of the heads of the federal regulatory agencies, for example, the Fed chair. And the job of the council is to make sure we don't get 2008 again. If there is an institution out there, look at AIG, whose failure could lead to a wholesale collapse of the financial economy, the Stability Oversight Council is supposed to regulate and intervene. The Consumer Protection Bureau, made famous by the connection with Elizabeth Warren, the job there is to, well, let's have a watchdog organization to make sure that we don't get into this kind of regime of predatory lending and the duping of consumers, again, leading to the housing bubble. Now, a more obscure piece of the legislation, the Volcker Rule. What the Volcker Rule does is to say, look, financial institutions should not be allowed to trade in securities. This goes all the way back to Glass-Steagall and an idea of securities being too speculative. Now, the problem with the Volcker Rule is it's not a rule. What it is an acclamation and a call for the regulators to actually craft a rule. Guess what? It's being crafted at this very moment, and the question is whether or not this rule will have any teeth. The same goes for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. The same goes to the Financial Stability Oversight Council. And whether or not Dodd-Frank meets the promise of new policy or it's just more of the same free market emphasis toward Wall Street really depends upon us. It depends upon us in terms of political activism and awareness. So the last piece of the presentation is a link to the Americans for Financial Reform. It's one watchdog organization that's keeping a careful eye on financial reform. I highly recommend it to you. There are others as well. Again, because Dodd-Frank only provides a vehicle. Whether or not it actually has teeth is going to depend upon executive authority, it's going to depend upon congressional oversight, and it's going to depend upon how the agencies actually implement it, which means that we need democratic accountability and pressure to be put to bear. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hackney. And now we'd like to hear from Senator Wolf.
I'm going to, because time constrained, I'm going to take my written speech and throw it there. And I'm just going to speak to you from the gut and from the heart for a minute, because this needs to be won from the gut and from the heart. And it needs to be done in partnership with the intellectual community and the business community, but it involves political leadership. A couple of thank yous first. Michael Dukakis, for being what you've been for the Commonwealth for an entire lifetime. We thank you, and for inviting us. And Barry Bluestone, thank you, man, for putting this together. I think this is going to replicate itself all over the country. My daughter, Zoe Wolf, who has helped organize this. Zoe, would you wave? She is going to keep my ass in gear, because if she doesn't keep it in gear, she's just going to run against me. I know that. And she could do it next year. I want to recognize my wife, Heidi, who's sitting back there as well. If you want to chat with Heidi, go down to Dewey Square. She's going to be down there tomorrow spending the day at Dewey Square. And then my second daughter, who's here, Stella Wolf. Stella, take a wave, who I'm also proud of, the moral compass for me. My third daughter, Ruby, is down at NYU now, and she's been camping out with the protesters down there. So our family is well represented in all of this. I just want to start with a couple of, thank you, a couple of quotes, a little bit of personal history, and then I'm going to wrap it up. Quote number one, Justice Louis Brandeis said like 100 years ago, and I have to be careful in academia saying this because someone's going to correct me. It wasn't Louis Brandeis, it wasn't 100 years ago. But he said, you can either have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, or you can have democracy. But you can't have both. And this will be relevant in a minute. The second quote I'm going to use is Willie Sutton, and somebody's going to correct me because maybe it wasn't him that said it. But somebody asked him why he robbed banks, and his answer was, because that's where the money is. Now, what does that have to do with politics? I'm going to get to that in a second. In 1979, October 28th, I was involved in an action of civil disobedience, blocking the entrance to Wall Street. Because in 1979, when I was down there, the top 1% in this country earned about 8% of the income in this country. And I'm not going to go through the statistics now because you've been seeing them all day. But that wasn't acceptable in 1979, the top 1% earning 8%. The top 5% controlled between 30 and 40% of the assets in this country. That number, as you saw earlier, is over 70% now. Okay? I went to Wesleyan University, studied political science and economics, and what we were studying in the 70s was this is what's going to happen to an economic system, i.e. capitalism, unless there is a strong democracy and government to stop it from happening. And you know what? What was predicted back then by the professors that I studied with is exactly what has happened. This isn't a surprise. This was predictable, and it has come true. I'm going to take 3 sectors of our economy, and I'm only picking 3 because I want to be able to forget the third so you can all laugh. Okay? Number 1, and this isn't random, food production. If you go to a supermarket now and look around that supermarket, what you are seeing in action is what happens when you have a Food and Drug Administration of our government that is controlled by food interests. That's what happens. It's not a surprise that we have the obesity problem. It's not a surprise that we have the diabetes problem. It's not a surprise that health care costs are rising because our population is less healthy. That's because the regulations and the oversight is being run by an agency that wants to increase the profits of those mega food companies. This isn't a surprise, and by the way, this is not a left and right thing. I'm not way out on the extreme left. It's a top and bottom thing. That's what we're here talking about today. That's the food industry. It doesn't work. There is a solution. All of this stuff has a solution. We talk about grow local, grow fresh. We talk about a distribution system which isn't flying produce halfway around the world. to end up on a supermarket shelf, ruining, the environment and all the other things. There are solutions to this. I'm going to pick number 2, energy production. Energy production, energy distribution, energy consumption. Okay? I'm from the Cape and Islands. We've been looking at a project in the Cape and Islands for 11 years. The largest the largest wind project in the United States of America. It would have been the largest in the world if we had built it back then. Okay? It hasn't been built. We are looking in our backyard, right where we sit, at 2 nuclear power plants, one of which is 40 years old and about to be relicensed. And I'm telling you something, if we weren't putting unregulated energy profits ahead of a smart, long-term, visionary energy policy, we wouldn't be relicensing 40-year-old nuclear plants and not building renewable, sustainable energy. And believe me, guys, the speech goes a little deeper, but I'm doing this quick because I know I got to speak in negative time here. The third thing I'm going to talk about is financial services. You've heard it all over the place. Okay? I did start a company 25 years ago. It's an employee-owned company. I think it's been a fairly responsible company. I've also served on the board of 2 banks during that time. One, a publicly traded bank, which sold out and got absorbed into the big, ugly banking thing. And the other now is I serve on a mutual bank down in the Cape. It's about a $2 billion bank. It's a socially responsible, economically responsible financial institution. It lends money, it takes deposits, it doesn't recklessly invest. It's a model for how our communities should be served by our financial institutions. We have become slaves to our economy, and our economy is supposed to be a tool. It frustrates me as a business guy to hear it black or white. Business bad, business good. That's like saying hammer bad, hammer good. The hammer lies on the table. It can tear down a house, it can build a house. That's our economy. That's our economy. The job of government, I thought, which is why I stepped out of the private sector and ran for office 1.5 years ago, the job of our government is to hear the collective will, to hear the collective conscience. The collective will, the collective conscience. The conscience is how we want to treat each other and how we want to treat ourselves. That is our conscience. And the collective will is, what kind of world do we want this to be, not next quarter, not next year, but 30 or 40 or 50 years from now? When you have kids the age my kids are, that's what you think about. Collective will and collective conscience. That's the role of government. Previous speaker talked about an activist government. You bet your ass we need an activist government. We need a government that represents us. And Dewey Square, what's happening there and what's happening in New York, what you're seeing is the beginnings of people who don't like the world they're living in now. They don't feel right about it. Okay? Not all of these people who spent 4 years studying it at schools. No, they're not going to write the prescription and the answers on the back of an envelope and hand it to anybody. That's our job. It's our job in the universities, it's our job in government to come up with answers and deliver them in ways that are consistent with the collective will and the collective conscience. So that's why I'm in government. I will tell you, there are not enough people in government, and I think the taboo is never diss your colleagues in government. But you know what? We need to speak truth to power these days. Okay? And we need to speak truth to power and say, it's not about special interests. It's not about who has the money to support us or even the time to show up at our fundraisers. It's about the people who scrap to have the time just to go to the polls to vote with all the challenges they have. And those are the people we truly need to represent. We all need to hold our government accountable to that, from Barack Obama to the representative in your neighborhood. Because the only tool we have left, and a previous speaker said it, the only tool we have to fix this is our government. If I thought the private sector was going to fix it, I'd be the CEO of American Airlines now. It's not going to come out of the private sector. It's going to come out of the government. I've gone on way too long. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Wolf. And finally, we have John Cuoco.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. The question that the panel was posed is, what went wrong? I would like to offer 2 perspectives, 2 answers to that. One is the straightforward answer to the question, a lot of which has already been suggested by previous speakers, And that has a lot to do with the shifting balance between the public and private sectors that has occurred historically and occurs in real time in the U.S. economy. The second answer, if I can have my presentation up, the second answer is, I'm sorry. That was it. My fault, thanks. The second answer is consistent with the spreading of doom that periodically has occurred today. I want to raise a somewhat more alarming possibility, and that is that there is a historic balance between the public and private sectors. But something new has happened in the last go-round of this cycle, and that is the emergence of what some fear may be a more or less self-sustaining third pole, and that is the banking sector. And I want to talk about, in part, why it is that this last set of events raises this more alarming possibility. The figure that I have here, the picture, is actually a statue that is in Washington, D.C., that stands in front of the Federal Trade Commission building. The Federal Trade Commission, as most of you know, has both an antitrust role. It serves as one of the guardians of competition policy in this country, and also a regulatory role in its role as a consumer protection agency. This statue depicts a rather strong person trying to restrain an equally strong horse. And the statue is called Man Controlling Trade. And this is emblematic of the Federal Trade Commission's mission. And it also, in some ways, describes historically the role of government. The role of government has long been to step in when imbalances arise as a result of profound transformations in the economy or economic crises. Again, to speed through some of these slides and not to go too far into history, in the late 1800s, the rise of telecommunications and railroads in this country created a lot of monopolies and created concern over monopolistic practices and gave rise to both the first federal regulatory agency, the Interstate Commerce Commission, but also the first federal antitrust statute, the Sherman Act. Both were responses to particular practices that occurred at the time. Those institutions, the laws, and the agencies gained traction over time, but over time it became clear that they were inadequate to the tasks that events presented to them. Specifically, during the 1920s, with the stock market crash and the Great Depression, we had another serious intervention advance of the line of demarcation between the public sector and the private sector, with the institution of many regulatory agencies covering a large number of specific industries, as well as banking and financial services, as James Hackney and others have documented. What happened in this, what we can see from these cycles and others as well, is that there is a tendency over time for imbalances to arise as a result of deregulation or other significant crises or transformations in the economy. This is a counterclockwise flow here. Deregulation creates imbalances. That creates the need for another successive advance of the public sector through the institution of new regulatory agencies or legislation to prevent some of the abuses that otherwise would occur. And what we have seen since the New Deal, of course, and certainly over the last 40 years, is the result of a substantial deregulation of our economy. Again, James Hackney has sort of recounted much of this with changes in technology that have altered the way the stock market works, with financial innovations, so-called, like credit default swaps and other derivatives, but also with the release of commercial banks to intermingle their investment bank and insurance functions, and some other things. And as we all know, what resulted from this was and certainly exacerbated by the subprime mortgage problem, was the collapse of 2008 and jeopardy to the entire real economy as well as the financial sector. So where were the protectors? Where were the protections to us as the 99%? The answer is these had been systematically dismantled through a process of deregulation. What had happened was that the key financial institutions were headed by people whose last names are things like Greenspan and Rubin and Cox and Summers, all of whom were either pragmatic or ideological deregulators, and either took explicit actions to release some of the banks and financial institutions from their historic constraints, the corridors that Governor Patrick was describing this morning. In addition, the institutions themselves came under pressure. The attack on the federal government and on the public sector led to substantial cuts in staffing and in salaries. The FBI investigative staff right now has fewer than 1/4 of the staff deployed for white-collar criminal fraud that they did in the S&L crisis, which was an order of magnitude smaller some 30 years ago. Federal Reserve staff has not increased in 20 years. The SEC has been a particular target of cutbacks and has had a number of restraints placed on it with a view that their efforts to preserve or increase regulation of some of the new financial instruments was essentially jeopardizing the release of stockholder value. Well, we know how that worked. So the question now is the cycle simply repeating itself? And the concern is that we have had this huge bailout, and I agree with my colleague Bill Dickens, of course, that the bailout was necessary. It was inadequate, but the world without it would have looked much scarier indeed. So I don't doubt for a moment that what was done was necessary. What I'm worried about is what was not done. What was not done is that few, if any, criminal charges have been brought against the perpetrators of the crimes that we've all been victims of. In the S&L crisis, hundreds of bankers went to jail. Investigations of more than 1,000 people were conducted. The present record pales in comparison with a handful of people ever charged and virtually nobody in jail. Second thing is that many of those who helped create the problem were invited back into this administration. The view was that they were too smart to leave on the outside. That's not my view of these people. But the minute that they were brought back into the administration, I feared that we were not going to address this in the way that was necessary. And indeed, that has been exactly what has happened. In addition, the Dodd-Frank law, as has been described, on paper would seem to address many of the issues, but it is being chipped away and compromised at every turn. And as a result, we do not have the kind of institutional changes and legislative initiatives that followed the last crisis in the 1920s and 1930s. And this is the concern that I have, that somehow the link that my previous chart showed, that with imbalance we have more regulation, restoring balance, that link has been broken, that now the banks have got the money, but there are no strings attached. Or in the somewhat more evocative phrase of the Occupy movement, the banks got bailed out. Thank you. The evidence for this is overwhelming. Banks are now bigger than before the crisis. 25 years ago, the top 10 banks by assets accounted for about 17% of total bank assets. 10 years ago, it was up to 41%. 4 years ago, it was 57%. Now they are 64% of total bank assets are concentrated in the top 10 banks. So I'm not worried about the small banks. I'm not worried about just to be clear, I'm not worried about the good citizens here. I'm worried about the large banks that truly dominate that sector and dominate it to an ever larger degree. But that's comparing the top 10 to the rest of banks. How about we compare it to, for example, GDP? Are they growing relative to the economy? The answer is you bet. The top 10 banks have nearly doubled relative to GDP in this country in the last, 10 years. In 2001, they were 25%. They are now 48% relative to overall GDP. And the next slide shows the political economy of this. How do they compare to the federal government, if that's a measure of relative bargaining power? The assets of the top 10 were just over 100%, just slightly larger than government revenues in 2001. They are now more than 3 times as large. Now, the total bank assets in countries like Ireland and Iceland are much larger relative to GDP or the federal or the government sectors in those economies than in the U.S. But the story is nonetheless clear. We're drifting in the direction of having a sector that is independently large and independent to a larger degree of the restraints of the federal government. Profits in this sector have also exploded, as has been documented before. And so what I would offer as the alarming possibility is, again, that the cycle by which balance is restored through the shifting of the line between the public and private sectors, that balance is now in jeopardy. That we now have, and a number of people have argued, that we have more or less instituted the possibility of a permanent imbalance with moral hazard, this ability of large banks to act without concern about the direct consequences to them, knowing that bailouts may be available to them, that is now ingrained in the financial sector. We've already had an example of yet another harbinger of potential trouble. Just in the past week or two, MF Global, a very large hedge fund, has gone under as a result of many of the same practices that we were concerned about 4 years ago and a number of people were concerned about 10 and 15 years ago. And if so, the concern is we may be headed for repeated and quick busts of businesses and financial institutions with the need for ever more expensive bailouts, and at that point, the system has in fact collapsed. So what is our to-do list? Man controlling, or person, we should now say, controlling trade is a very good theme. It means that there is an urgent need for more decisive action with respect to the largest banks, to hold people and institutions responsible, to employ a true Volcker rule. Paul Volcker has said he doesn't like the Volcker rule that now is being bandied around Washington. It has morphed into something that even he doesn't recognize. But a true Volcker rule to divide practices between commercial banks and the riskier sides of those businesses, and to impose generally tougher regulation, or if rules and regulation are not what you want, you break up the banks. The largest banks, by every economic study, are now several times as large as any economy of scale, any efficiency or cost saving necessary. That is an economic fact that is not really in serious dispute. And it does mean that the top handful of banks that I've talked about here as growing ever larger are good targets for breaking up if they will not subject themselves to government regulation. So this is, I believe, the historic responsibility of the public sector, to control trade for the benefit of all of the 99%. Thank you.
So I think the good news here is that this panel has caught up a lot of time for us. They were terrific, and please join me again in thanking them.